Hello, everyone, and now we're going to be reviewing time period 2 history from 1450 to 1750. This is going to take you through units 3 and 4 of AP World History. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first thing is the unit for land-based empires. And the basic idea is that great land-based empires, large land-based empires, emerged between 1450 and 1750 after the fall of the Mongols, and they controlled diverse populations. So all empires always have to deal with dealing diversity. First, these new land-based empires expanded through military force and superior weapons. Second, they centralized the operations of the government through bureaucracy. Now, numbers 1 and 2 speaks about how these governments consolidated and centralized power. 3, these governments used faith systems to create unity and justify power throughout their empires. And 4, they used the arts and architecture to promote the strength of the central state. So for numbers 3 and 4, that emphasizes how they justified or legitimized their power. So 1 and 2 in the letter A section, number 1 and 2 talks about how they gained the power. Number 3 and 4 is how they justified and or legitimized their power. So the rest of it is just details. Now, when we look at this particular time, some of the big empires to keep in mind on: 1, in the Middle East, we have the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid dynasty. The Ottoman Empire is in the Middle East. It's in Turkey, Southeast Europe, and North Africa. The Safavid dynasty is in Persia or present-day Iran. In South Asia, we have the Mughal Empire. In East Asia, we have the Ming Empire and then the Qing Empire in China. So the Ming Empire is a native Chinese dynasty, whereas the Qing dynasty is an ethnic minority called the Manchu, who are ruling over all of China. And then also in East Asia, it's worth time just paying attention to the Tokugawa shogunate that's developing in Japan. Then you have the Russian Empire that's growing out of their experience with the Golden Horde and solidifying as a central state. West Europe, we have 5 major countries starting to centralize their power: Great Britain, Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, and France. We're going to see a lot of this in the next unit. And then lastly, in West Africa, we have the Songhai Empire, which is really a continuation of the Mali Empire in West Africa. So the first thing we want to look at is the expansion of the empires. How did they gain control? And the major way that they gained control was through superior weapons like gunpowder, cannons, and also sending out ships that are armed to protect overseas trade. With the gunpowder, we typically have what's called the gunpowder empires, which are the Mughal, the Ottoman, and the Safavid. But you can also include in Russia and the Qing Empire as empires that used gunpowder weapons, particularly cannons, to increase their boundaries. The other thing is that as these empires expand, they come into conflict with nearby states. For example, the Safavid and the Ottoman empires are going to develop a rivalry. This is largely based in religion, where the Safavid was Shiite Muslim and the Ottomans were Sunni Muslim. And that's going to put them into conflict with one another. The Safavid also have conflicts along the border with the Mughal Empire, and the Songhai and the Morocco conflict that's going to take place and eventually end the Songhai as the Morocco come in with gunpowder-based weapons. But that's another example of 2 empires that are going to expand and come into contact with each other. So not only do we see conflict between states, but we also see conflict with local authorities. So kings, especially in West Europe, are solidifying their power. And in order to solidify the power, they have to take power from the landed nobility. And this is particularly true in France, Britain, Spain. Those are the big 3, where the landed nobility are kind of resisting the centralization efforts of the king. Now, one of the other things we should mention is Tamerlane's empire. So in about the late 1300s into the early 1400s, there's an attempt to recreate the Mongol Empire. And this is done by a descendant of Genghis Khan named Timur the Lame, or as he's known in the West as Tamerlan. And what Tamerlane is going to do is build up a large empire. He's going to, in a way, this is the last of the nomadic empires. Um, and he's going to conquer the Delhi Sultanate, which is going to kind of make the opportunity for the Mughal Empire to grow. So Tamerlane's attempt at making an empire only lives as long as he lives. And once he dies, that empire starts to fall apart. And out of the ashes of that empire is going to emerge the Safavid, the Mughal, and elements of the Ottoman Empire. Now, when we look at the gunpowder empires, the Safavid, Mughal, and Ottomans, there's four things that you want to keep in mind. One, all three of these states are Turkish in origin, and they originate from Turkish traditions. Second, they all follow the breakup of khanates within that region. And the khanates, of course, had provided central rule to a lot of Eurasia. With the khanates gone, there are new central kingdoms that are filling the vacuum left by the breakup of the Mongol Empire. The role of gunpowder is critical to the rise of these empires. That's why we call them the gunpowder empires. And then all three of them are Muslim-based empires, but their attitude towards religions differ very, very greatly. The Safavid are diehard Shiite Muslims. The Ottomans are passionate about their Sunni allegiance. And the Mughal, they are Sunni in nature, but religion isn't as much of a driving force. And this is going to explain a lot of religious policies for all three of these countries or empires as we get there. The next thing, governments maintain control through centralization, and that's how all governments maintain control. And one, a bureaucratic system will be created. So bureaucracies are ways for the central government to enforce their central rule. So in the Ottoman Empire, you have the Devshmir. So what happens is that the Ottoman Empire demands, particularly from Southern Europe, Christian boys to be handed over to the Ottoman Empire. These boys are going to be given an education, and they're going to become technically slaves of the Sultan, but they're going to end up staffing a lot of the bureaucracy in the Ottoman Empire. And some of them will even go into the military corps called the Janissary. The salaried samurai, so in Tokugawa shogunate, in the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, what's happened is that a shogun has assumed central power. And instead of allowing the samurai to be loyal to local rulers, the samurai are going to be employed by the central state in order to take this warrior class and make them loyal to the central government and give the central government a way of enforcing rules and collecting taxes at a local level. Justices of the peace and intendants. So the justices of the peace are British, the intendants are French. And what's going to happen is that the justices of the peace are going to enforce the royal central law. They're going to come in and settle legal disputes, and they're going to keep those settlements in line with the king's will. Whereas in France, the intendants are agents of the royal government or agents of the king that go out and make sure that the nobles are practicing the laws and policies that the king intends for them to follow through on. And so, both of these are ways of the king exerting greater control over nobility. And then in China, both the Ming and the Qing, we have a reemergence of the civil service exams. So the Confucian scholars that we were introduced to in the Song Dynasty are reemerging as a significant force within the bureaucracy after the Mongols have left. Now, the other thing is that central governments are going to use arts and the monumental architecture to demonstrate the state's strength. So one example of this can be the European palaces. The Palace of Versailles in France is meant to convey the power of the king. Likewise, Renaissance and Baroque art is going to be patronized art, and the leaders that patronize the art are glorifying themselves. So we're going to have, particularly in Baroque art, a lot of leaders, a lot of kings commission their portraits to display and to demonstrate and project a sense of power and a sense of control. We also see this in Mughal mausolea and mosques. So a mausolea is a burial place. Basically, the Taj Mahal is a great example of a mausolea. And mosques, of course, are, religious centers for Islam. So you have this, or places of worship for Islam. So you have this idea that these monumental architectural projects are meant to demonstrate the strength and sophistication of the kingdom. And the other thing is that these things serve as an example of syncretism. And this incorporates elements of the local culture with elements of the Islamic culture. So if you were to look at the Taj Mahal, we see elements of South Asian culture combining in with elements of Persian culture. If you look at the Safavid, we see Turkish and Persian influences come together in the Great Mosque or the Blue Mosque. In Constantinople, which is at the center of the Ottoman Empire, the Hagia Sophia is converted into a mosque, which is going to blend both Greek and Turkish traditions. So keep in mind that these are examples of where cultures are going to blend together. And the other thing that we could add in with the arts and monumental architecture are examples of portraits of Chinese emperors. The Chinese emperors also commissioned portraits of themselves as a way of demonstrating strength and power. The other thing that gets used is belief systems, and they're used to promote legitimacy of power. So the kings basically say, it's God's will that I rule over you. So one, we have the divine right theory in West Europe and Russia. Both kings and the czar both claim to be God's representative on earth to rule in God's place. And that divine right theory justifies the centralization of power under the king and the losing of power amongst the nobility. In Safavid and Songhai and also the Ottoman Empire, there are claims of being descendants or being the caliph. And the caliph is a religious and political figure kind of fused into one and is meant to be the successor of Muhammad. So to claim that you're a caliph is to make a powerful claim that you are the successor to the prophet of Allah. In Japan, Shintoism is a native-based religion that emphasizes the deification, in other words, the divineness of the emperor. And even though the emperor has no real power, the big thing about Shintoism is that it's a natural Japanese religion as opposed to a foreign religion. So it fits perfectly in with the Tokugawa shogunate, this emphasis of Japaneseness or Japanese culture and tradition. So Shintoism is used by the shogun as exerting legitimacy because of his honoring of Japanese traditions. And then, of course, in China, we have Confucianism. And for this is a continuity. This is nothing new. This idea that Confucianism emphasizes obedience, it emphasizes and glorifies the scholar. And these Confucian-based exams become the basis of the bureaucracy of China. Then we have tax collection. Of course, none of this is possible without tax collectors. So in the Ottoman Empire, there's a group of people who are hired out by the government named tax farmers, and their job is to collect taxes from the local communities on behalf of the government. Now, of course, what these tax farmers do is they take a little bit off the top. In the Mughal Empire of South Asia, we have the zamindars, and the zamindars are local landowners, so they're already a powerful segment of society, and they're charged with collecting taxes, and then they do the same thing. They keep some of it for themselves, and they pay the correct money to the government, and then they keep a little extra for themselves. And then in something like Aztec Empire, China, Songhai, there are tribute systems. And for somebody like China or for Mexico or the Aztec people, the tribute system is not extensively the responsibility of a bureaucracy. Basically, tribute letters were sent to the local tribes, and the local tribes are expected to comply. So all these empires have to come up with a way to collect this revenue. All right, the empires had diverse religious populations. So in West Europe, we have this breakdown actually of Christianity, where Protestant Reformation leads to a breakaway from the Catholic Church. And now you've got two groups of people, the Protestants and the Catholics, and they begin to engage in conflict and wars. So in West Europe, the division is expanding. And what it does is it undermines the church powers, which is only going to help the rise of central states. these central states are going to get more involved in religious questions, which allows them to exert more authority over the population. In the Mughal Empire, you have a Muslim government ruling over a Hindu majority. So when we look at the Mughal Empire, about 20% of that empire is Muslim, whereas the other 80% is Hindu. And that's going to create a different type of relationship. Under Akbar the Great, he practiced a great deal of religious acceptance, and he's going to emphasize not taxing the non-Muslims. He's going to support the building of temples for Hindus. He's going to bring in court musicians. That's more of a Hindu tradition than Islam. However, over time, that tolerance starts to diminish. By the time we get to Aurangzeb, who is, I believe, the great-grandson or the grandson of Akbar the Great, so it's only a few generations, Aurangzeb starts to tax the Hindus. He stops the funding of temples. He kicks out the court musicians. Basically, he begins to follow a stricter form of Islam, which to him does not allow for a lot of room of Hindu traditions. This is going to increase the tensions between the Hindus and the Muslims. Then we have the development of Sikhism. So we have this religion that forms around late 1400s, early 1500s. And the ideology is actually a fusion of both Muslim and Hindu traditions. So what Sikhism does is it brings in the compassionate side of one God and combines that with the idea that there's many different ways of understanding God. So it kind of rectifies the two religions into a new ideology. Now, this is going to create tensions with the Mughals because the Mughals are going to see the Sikhs as a splinter group that's a threat to the stability of society, especially later after Akbar. And that's going to lead to conflict and wars between the Sikhs who are fighting against the Mughal government. In the Ottoman Empire, which is heavily Sunni, the Ottomans are going to extend to Christian and Jewish communities limited rights. So one such thing is the jizya, which is the expectation that they would pay a tax, the Christians and the Jews would pay a non-Muslim tax. Millets are Jewish and Christian communities that were formed that were granted a certain amount of autonomy to deal with local affairs. Finally, the concept of people of the book is important because Christians and Jews were seen as worshiping the God of Abraham just as the Muslims were. And to the Muslims, somebody who has become monotheistic and worships the God of Abraham is not somebody you harass. In other words, they're on the right path, they're just not perfect. And the idea of tolerance is rooted within this concept. Now, you have to keep in mind that tolerance is a relative thing. One sultan may practice more tolerant policies than another. So, the tolerance of these two religious minorities is going to vary throughout the time period of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the relationship with Shia Islam, to the Ottomans, the Shia Muslims are just wrong. And so any Shia Muslims would have been heavily persecuted and forced to convert, if at all possible. The Safavid dynasty is governed by the Shia Muslim, and they developed a teaching class called the mullahs, or a scholar class that was charged with teaching society the proper morals of Islamic faith. And the Safavid are going to be even harsher on Sunni dissidents. So the Sunni Muslims are going to be forced to convert or they're going to be killed. Christians and Jewish communities had more rights within the Safavid, but even they felt the pressure of converting over to Shia Islam. And then lastly, we go to Tokugawa, Japan, and the Tokugawa shogunate, as Christianity is introduced, feel that Christianity is a threat to the stability of the government. And therefore, they're going to heavily persecute the Christians, outlawing Christianity on the island. That continues through all the way to the 19th century. So a couple comparisons as you look at this, and I don't really need to go through this too much. One, the military strength concept. A lot of these kingdoms utilized enslaved people as soldiers. So for example, in the Ottoman Empire, they had the Janissary, which was an offshoot of the Devshiram. In the Safavid, you had the Ghulmans, and the Ghulmans are going to incorporate non-Turkish minorities, such as Armenians, to serve in the military of the Safavid. So that's a very common theme to keep in mind, and the idea that there will be frequent conflicts between these empires. Bureaucracies, you want to be able to compare and contrast the way tax collection was done, the ways laws were standardized and enforced, in other words, the bureaucracy. And you also want to appreciate the degree of complexity of the bureaucracy. So China had a very extensive bureaucracy, whereas the Aztecs, relying on a tribute system, didn't have an extensive bureaucracy. The tax policies, you want to focus on how they're collected. That becomes a little redundant. And then lastly, the idea of art, architecture, and religion legitimizing authority. So you want to be able to compare the ways that these three topics were used to legitimize the central government's power. So that's your land-based empires. Now we go to Unit 4, which is the Maritime Empire. So basic idea is that Western European states, Portugal, Spain, Britain, Netherlands, and the French, established empires that stretched overseas, and that's a new development in world history. We haven't seen these type of global empires. Usually an empire is just expanding its borders physically. In this case, they're expanding their reach across the seas. And the focus is going to be in the Americas and Southeast Asia. This brought together Afro-Eurasia and the Americas, which is going to produce a significant result. So our first topic dealt with technological innovations, and a lot of the technological innovations that allow Europe to establish a global empire, a maritime empire, comes from the world of Islam. A lot of Muslim merchants were already using these technologies. They had made their way to West European sailors, and they get integrated into the West European seagoing practices. Some of these are tools of navigation, such as the compass, such as the stern post rudder. The other thing is that we have shipbuilding process. So you have the flute, you have the carrack, and you have the caravel. And those three, the flute, carrack, and caravel, those three are just lighter, nimbler ships that are built for trade and trade only. So they can carry more cargo, they can carry more supplies, and they can withstand the rougher seas longer, which means they can engage in longer voyages. Now we can also throw in the astrolabe, we can throw in the stern post rudder, we can throw in the lateen sails. Those are your big innovations, and they're all coming out of the Muslim world into Western Europe. Now the shipbuilding process I just talked about, those different ships, the flute, the carrack, and the caravel, those three ships, like I said, are able to withstand the rougher seas, go on longer voyages, carry more shipment, and carry more cargo. And these are merchant purpose ships. Cartography, the making of maps. Basically, the Europeans get better at making maps. And as they explore on these expeditions, map making is going to help them out tremendously. And then lastly, schools of navigation. This is an example of how the state sponsors these explorations by exposing the sailors to new pieces of knowledge. This is particularly true with Prince Henry the Navigator within Portugal. And the idea was to teach the upcoming sailors how to use these new technologies. So we go to exploration causes and events. The idea is that most of this exploration is state-sponsored. The state is paying for it. And there's one exploration that we should mention, or one expedition we should mention, and that's the Ming Dynasty and the Cheng-He voyages. So here, the state is sponsoring a bunch of what we call treasure ships, 7 different expeditions. And this is a sizable undertaking. And what it's meant to do is early, like 1415 is a good year to remember. China is expanding its influence across the Indian Ocean, not by colonizing, but by enticing other leaders to engage in trade with China. Now, in about the 1430s, these voyages are going to come to an end as the Confucian bureaucracy says, trade is not something we should invest our time in. We should invest our time rather in fortifying our defenses on the Western front against the nomadic groups. And of course, that's the Great Wall. So, these treasure ships end up in dry dock by 1431. And a lot of historians say this is a missed opportunity because China could have been in the Indian Ocean as a major power when the Portuguese show up. The other state sponsor of the exploration deals with mercantilism. And mercantilism is an economic theory, but it also is going to have political results. It creates competition between these states. And the idea of European mercantilism is that there's only so much wealth in the world. And if you get wealthier, somebody else has to be getting poorer. So this leads to kind of a colonial race. It leads to a race to influence more of the globe before another European country does. Next, and so that's the state is, since it's in the state's interest to expand, they're going to be driving a lot of these policies. The Portuguese exploration. So Prince Henry the Navigator suggests that there's a straight water route to the Indian Ocean around the tip of Africa. Now, of course, Portugal, Spain, they're trying to access the Asian markets for economic gain. Prince Henry is the one who begins the series of expeditions down the West African coast. It's Vasco da Gama who finds his way around the southern coast of Africa into the Indian Ocean trade network. Now, the Portuguese are going to start establishing a trading post empire. And while they don't take over extensive lands, they start to establish their presence along the coastal lines of Africa, South Asia, and into East Asia. And this trading post empire allows the Portuguese to exert greater influence. Now, that's going to eventually be overtaken by the Dutch. The Spanish exploration goes west across the Atlantic Ocean. Columbus is going to run into the Americas, and the Spanish subsequently is going to start setting up a Spanish empire within the Americas, which is going to allow the Spanish to expand their power. The Netherlands are going to come in about the 1600s, and where the Netherlands are different is their use of the joint stock company. So instead of state sponsorship, what a joint stock company does is it seeks out investors to chip in and support expeditions through private funding. And the promise of this is to share in the profits. Now, this joint stock company is significant because it's going to increase the number of expeditions, not only by the Dutch, but also by the English. And the Dutch are going to make their way to Japan and to Southeast Asia. They're going to establish a much greater presence in both of those than other European countries. In Southeast Asia, they're going to start building up eventually a colony system in what we call the Dutch East Indies. In Japan, Japan isolates itself from European contact, except for the Dutch. And the Dutch are allowed to trade with Japan once a year in the port of Nagasaki under very strict conditions. But the other thing to keep in mind with the Dutch is that they weren't so interested in spreading Christianity, and that's most likely why they were so supported by this. England and France are also going to engage in expansion starting in the 1700s, really, 1600s, 1700s. And England and France are going to start putting colonies and putting a presence in South Asia and the Caribbean and in North America that's eventually going to bring them into conflict. All right. The Columbian Exchange is the next thing. So the Columbian Exchange, I think a lot of people know this. So diseases, particularly from Europe, come into the Americas. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, and they're going to cause havoc and chaos amongst the American population. We predict between 50 and 90% of the Native American population died as a consequence of these diseases. And also disease vectors are going to get introduced into the ecosystem. A disease vector is something that spreads disease. So for example, black rats were responsible for the spread of the bubonic plague because fleas that would transmit the virus back and forth between humans and rats, fleas were coming along for the ride. So rats are going to come off the European ships and start to integrate themselves into America. And that's going to introduce a disease vector that's going to allow for diseases to spread. Animals and food. From Europe to the Americas, sugar is the big crop you want to pay attention to. Livestock such as cattle, sheep, chickens, pigs, those are going to start coming and multiplying in very quickly within the Americas. Wheat is going to get planted into the Americas. And then lastly, horses are going to be introduced to the American peoples. And think about how that's going to have an impact on the Native American society. From America to Afro-Eurasia, this is the more important one: the potato, tobacco, maize, and cacao. Now, potato, maize, and cacao, what they do, actually cassava too, but potato is the big one. These are crops that can be grown in just about any terrain. And they're going to supply a great deal of nutrients. So what happens is that Afro-Eurasia, not just Europe, but all of Afro-Eurasia gets these new world crops that are high in like they're high in calories, high in nutrients, but they are low in calorie density. So when people eat these things, it's like they're getting all the calories they need in a much quicker amount of time. So that is going to lead to a growth in the Afro-Eurasian population. More people are living longer because they have more food to consume. If they live longer, they have more chance to make babies, and those babies have a better chance of living longer to the point that they can make babies. So whether you're in Africa, Europe, or you're in China, the population boom is significant, and it's attributed mostly to these new world crops. Also, there's an exchange of people. So obviously, Europeans are settling into the Americas. Also, we have enslaved Africans who are being brought against their will to the Americas to serve on plantations, particularly for sugar plantations. And of course, what this creates is a cultural impact, particularly when it comes to religion, but also food, music, clothing, so on and so forth, and language, where there's an intermingling of native, African, and European cultures. They're going to produce new forms of cultures that becomes, associated with Latin America today. All right, the next topic: the Maritime Empires were established. So this is going to be kind of going back over some things. So for the most part, we see a trading post empire established in Asia. Asia is too powerful to be conquered by the Europeans. So the Europeans start to establish not colonial presences. In Asia, they establish trading posts. So Britain is going to come into South Asia, making deals with local leaders to have access to ports along the Indian coast. Now, the reason why Europe could not expand easily into Africa and Asia is because there were plenty of kingdoms who could easily defend themselves. In other words, European technology was not so advanced that they had a significant edge over these other kingdoms. So the African and Asian kingdoms could do a pretty good job of resisting European expansion. Now, I always talk about the big five European states: Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. And all five of them are going to grow stronger during this period of time. They're going to expand in power and they're going to centralize more. However, they're not the only empires expanding and growing in power. Along in Africa, we have trading empires that emerge in connection to the enslaved African trade. So three kingdoms such as the Asante, the Congo, and Dahomey, these three kingdoms emerge because the leaders of their kingdoms, African leaders, are profiting from the trade of the enslaved Africans. Now, the other consequence of all of this is that there are global trade routes that they're going to develop. And one of these is the transatlantic trade, which is commonly referred to as the triangular trade. The triangular trade is going to see sugar transferred from the Americas to Europe. From Europe to Africa, we're going to see the flow of gunpowder weapons. We're going to see alcohol, which is connected to sugar, and we're going to see textiles. And then from Africa to the Americas, we're going to see the shipment on European ships of enslaved Africans. But the thing to keep in mind is that the Europeans are the enslavers, if you will, are making deals with local African leaders to hand over enslaved Africans. So recognize that the European ships are the ones bringing them over, but it's not like the Europeans were going inland. They tried to, but they ran into resistance. So they're going to create a trade arrangement that allows for slavery to grow in size. And of course, what causes the growth of this transatlantic slave trade is the desire for free labor for sugar plantations. The Native Americans were not lasting long on these type of enslaved labor, and the demand was outstripping the supply. So the Europeans turned to the native Africans. The Mediterranean trade and the trans-Saharan trade are both going to decline in activity. It's not that they disappear, they just decline because most of the action is taking place in the Atlantic Ocean. But the Indian Ocean is going to largely continue, with the Portuguese getting integrated into it. It's not like the Portuguese come to dominate the Indian Ocean trade, but they become kind of, annoying people that you do business with occasionally. All right. Now, the other thing is that these empires were maintained and developed. So I talked already about the role of mercantilism and joint stock companies and how they're important to funding future expeditions and future explorations. And this growth of ships on the seas is attributed to the state role that mercantilism encouraged and to the private investments brought on by the joint stock companies. We also already did talk about the increase in Atlantic slave trade, where the sugar plantations are creating the demand for the enslaved African labor. Europe has high demand for sugar, so sugar plantations are growing. They require more labor, and at this time, there's no idea of paying labor. They want labor that is free of charge. And this concept, when you introduce the African culture into the Americas, you're going to have a mixing of African, Native American, and European culture. And that's going to produce syncretic forms of cooking, syncretic forms of language, syncretic forms of religions. We also have this concept of chattel slavery. And so chattel slavery is basically where enslaved people were treated as transferable property. And that chattel slavery is unique in terms of the scope, but also in terms of the attitude towards the enslaved people themselves, where they are just a commodity to be traded on through the open market. Now, since the demand is for plantation workers, what happens is we have a shift because there's been a trade of enslaved Africans in the trans-Saharan trade already. But for the most part, the people being traded were women because they're usually working domestic roles. Now that we're on plantations, seeing the growth of a demand for physical labor for the harvesting of sugar, the demand becomes more focused on men. And as men are leaving Africa, that changes the role for women within Africa. They assume more economic and political roles in society. We also have another type of trade system called the development of silver trade. And silver trade becomes the first global trade commodity. And it is driven by a demand for China. From China, we get this decision by the government to collect taxes in silver. This happens under the Ming government. The Ming government goes, we're only going to collect taxes in silver. So Chinese merchants start to demand silver, and the Japanese and America's mines begin to produce more silver. And Japan is going to use that silver to increase their central army, which is starting to unify Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate. In Potosi, the world's largest silver deposit is going to start getting harvested. It's going to be mined. And Potosi is going to turn out silver in record numbers for a long period of time. But also silver mines in Mexico are going to increase the production of silver. All of this silver makes its way to China in some way, shape, or form. And one of those ways is called the Manila Galleon, which is a voyage from Mexico across the Pacific to the Philippines. And there, merchants, Spanish merchants, will meet with Chinese merchants and engage in that trade. And that's another way that silver starts to infiltrate the Chinese market. Now, competition is going to increase over trade routes between these European countries. So in the Indian Ocean, for example, Muslim merchants are going to compete with the Portuguese. The Portuguese are trying to impose rules and regulations that benefit them. And essentially the Muslim leaders say, no, we're not doing this. So we're going to have conflict there. The trans-Saharan trade is going to see the Moroccan kingdom invade the Songhai Empire with gunpowder weapons And this is over dominance of the trade routes of the Trans-African Trade Network or the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. And then, of course, mercantilism, which encourages this competition, is going to create wars between Britain, France, Spain, Netherlands, and Portugal. Now, one other thing is to say that during these maritime expansions, Christian missionaries spread the Christian faith. So the Christian faith doesn't really penetrate South and East Asia because of the powerful states there. But it does see a rise in practice amongst enslaved Africans and Native Americans. And even though they become Christian, these two groups continue to practice elements of their traditional faiths while they're practicing Christianity. So we're going to get to many such things as Native Americans associating saints with their traditional gods, and enslaved Africans associating saints with spirits of nature that they had worshipped before they came over as an enslaved people. So there's going to be this effort by Christian missionaries to connect with local ideas, but also a continuity of the local traditions despite being Christian. So here you have the Americas being imposed Christianity, and there are people who find a way around it. And in the Philippines, we have something very similar where the Spanish are able to conquer the Philippines and impose Christianity. And many of the Filipinos convert over to Christianity, but continue to practice local traditions and local customs. All right, this is a long unit, so I think I've got about 4 more slides. There's going to be internal and external challenges to state power. So the idea is that you have these new states emerging, new states growing, and they're going to be challenged from both within and from outside. So in the Americas, we have the Pueblo revolts, where Native Americans reject the Spanish efforts to convert Native Americans over to Christianity. In Western Europe, we have the French Fronde, where a French monarch dies. The French nobility decide to take power and try to set back the move towards absolutism. This is ultimately going to fail, and in his place will become the most divine rightist king France has ever seen, a guy named Louis XIV. In Russia, we have the Cossack revolts. So the Cossack, I should say, the Cossacks are they're an ethnic minority that live within Russia, and they come from a tradition of a warrior culture. They become landowners, or not landowners, they become land workers, and they get kind of connected into the serf system. The Pugachev rebellion is an example of Russian serfs coming from the Cossacks, rising up against the landowners and the czars to demand greater freedoms and to protect rights that they feel were being eroded and being stepped on. In the Mughal Empire, we have the Maratha-Mughal Wars. So the Maratha are a group of Hindu warriors, and to them, the Mughal Empire, especially under Aurangzeb, is violating everything it means to be Hindu. So, this war is necessary to try and preserve Hindu traditions and Hindu religious identity. Ana Nzinga and the Portuguese. Ana Nzinga is the queen of a state either called Ndongo or Matumba. And both of those relate to the present-day state of Angola. So the Portuguese are trying to expand their presence and influence, and Nzinga is going to lead a resistance to keep the Portuguese at bay. Not only does she use military means to do it, but she also uses diplomatic means, and eventually keeps the Portuguese at bay to allow African rule of these kingdoms. In North America, we have the Netacom War, which is going to see Native Americans rising up against English settlers. In Jamaica, we have the Maroon Wars. Maroon societies are societies of escaped enslaved peoples who establish their own societies and basically act autonomously. The English are expanding across the Jamaican island, and that's going to run into the Maroon societies. To the Maroon societies, these English are just invaders. And so war is going to break out between these two groups. And then lastly, in Virginia, the Gloucester County Rebellion. And this is where both enslaved laborers and indentured laborers come together to fight back against the English who are employing them, to demand greater rights and better conditions for labor. That's obviously going to fizzle out after a while, but all of these are examples of challenges to the expansion of state power. Okay, next we have the idea that in all these states we're seeing changing social hierarchies. And the idea is that there's always hierarchy in society. There's always a division between an upper class and a lower class. Sometimes these classes can be based on religion. So for example, there's a strong anti-Semitism movement in Spain and a desire to get rid of the Jewish communities from Spain. And by 1492, the Jewish communities are expelled from Spain. And a lot of these Jewish communities, a lot of these members of these Jewish communities are going to make their way to the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire is far more tolerant of the Jewish people. So we're going to see in the Ottoman Empire an absorption of the Jewish communities, but these Jewish communities are going to be they're going to be granted limited tolerance. They may have religious freedoms, but political freedoms are going to be kind of tempered. In China, we see, well, actually not in China, but also the Americas, we see an example of ethnicity creating the basis for a hierarchy. So for example, the Han Chinese are the majority of people of China. And during the Ming Dynasty, it was a Han that ruled over all of China. When the Manchu come in during the Qing Dynasty, and the Manchu become the emperor class, they put the Han in a position of second-class citizenship. So forcing the Han to wear their hairstyle in a particular way, seeing a change in outfit styles so that they reflect more the Manchu than traditional Han society. All of these things are going to indicate this hierarchy that has emerged. And then we have the casta system in Latin America. We have at the very top this group that comes straight from Europe, the Peninsulares, and they're going to serve in colonial offices, and they're going to be, the enforcers of the Spanish bureaucracy. Then we have the Creoles, who are going to serve as the landowning class, and these are people of European descent who are born in the Americas. So the Peninsulares are going to look down on the Creoles. The Creoles are going to be envious of the power of the Peninsulares, and the Creoles don't quite understand, well, what's different about them? We're all European. Then we get down to mestizos and mulattoes. Mestizos are Native Americans and Europeans coming together to have children. So they have a mixed heritage. And then the mulattoes are an example of African and European mixed heritage. And then we can go further still with the African indigenous people mixing together and the indigenous people and the enslaved Africans. So this order of privilege and wealth and property ownership is determined by ethnicity. But what's important to keep in mind is that the mestizos and mulattoes may have been lesser than the Peninsulares and the Creoles, but that didn't mean they had nothing. They still did have some type of economic standing. It just wasn't as great as the Peninsulares and the Creoles. In West Europe, we're going to see a group of new elites start to form, because as trading is emerging and trading is growing, there's a new class that is making money off of this. And this new class, we would refer to them as a merchant class. So in West Europe, typically wealth was determined by land ownership. But now wealth is being determined by profits made from trade and from overseas expeditions. And this new merchant class is forming the basis of the bourgeoisie, because it's not just the merchants who are making money, but it's businesses associated with those merchants, such as bankers, that are making money. So now we have this new wealthy class, and they represent a challenge to the traditional elite, because this bourgeoisie, they're going to want to share in the political power. And to them, they are not going to feel that the nobles have any more special privilege than they do. That's going to set up for future tensions. I'm thinking of the French Revolution down the road. But one of these things that the new elites do, that the bourgeoisie do, and it's not just here in Europe, but it's across the globe. You see this merchant class that has more money, so what they do is they spend this money to show off their wealth, to show off their status, and particularly they focus on the arts. Portraits of merchants are going to start becoming more popular. Statues in people's yards are going to be more popular. And this idea of the funding of the arts was to project to the rest of the society the increasing importance of this class and to show the rising status of these people. And then one of the things you want to pay attention to in terms of historical thinking is continuity and change during this time period. Okay, so as you can see, I am finishing up. So continuity and change. So you see changes, for example, in social structure. So in the Americas, there was already an established social structure in the Inca and the Aztec Empire. But as the Europeans come in, you know, if you were a Native American that was ruling over other Native Americans, the Europeans are going to push you out of that status and establish a whole new social hierarchy based on identities. And yet there is some continuity, such as the idea that there's this strand or this habit of anti-Semitism within Europe, that bureaucracies are important to maintaining wide overspread colonies. You have this idea that there's change, there's also continuity during this time. So we don't think of 1450 and 1750 as a radically different time than 1200 and 1450. The Qing Empire is still using a bureaucracy that the Song Dynasty used. So you get this idea that there is continuity, but there's also emerging change. And one of the big changes is that Europe has now established itself on the global stage. And they're starting to leave that periphery that they are regulated to in the very first unit, in the first time period. So with that, that's your time period 2 in review. Next, we'll talk about time period 3, 1750 to 1900, and that'll be posted up in the next few days. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please reach out through email, and I will see you later. Bye.